Slavery is the ever-present and ever-invisible issue. It's everywhere.
Men like Adams were anti-slavery. Hamilton was anti-slavery. Jefferson knew it was wrong, but he practiced it.
The nation is built on slavery. However, no one wants to talk about it in the realms of the national government because it is literally a deal breaker of one sort or another.
The Constitution does not mention the word slavery. At the same time, there were a series of fatally significant compromises over the slave trade.
In order to maintain unity so that Republican government could prevail, despite the differences about slavery.
The framers made the compromises they did with slavery because they realized that no constitution could be ratified without them. Some states wanted to ban the importation of slaves, others wanted to preserve the slave trade. The compromise was to allow Congress to ban the importation of slaves, but only after 1808.
After 1808, the slave trade was illegal in the United States, supposedly illegal. Obviously, there were illegal shipments of people.
But in this period, the nation's expanding, and as it expands, every new state raises the issue, is this going to be a state where slavery is allowed or not?
The Missouri Compromise is made in 1820, with Missouri admitted to the Union as a slave state, while Maine comes in as a free state, maintaining the balance of power in the Senate between North and South.
And in 1819, Congress passed a new law that heightened penalties, that provided funds for the enforcement of the prohibition on the slave trade.
Now, when slave ships carrying illegal cargoes were captured, those potentially enslaved people would be turned over to the federal government and they would be then returned to Africa.
One ship, Antelope, becomes a symbol of the international traffic in human flesh. In 1820, Antelope is a Spanish ship buying slaves on the coast of Africa. It's captured by a competitor, a South American privateer that had already plundered American and Portuguese slave ships. Antelope and its captor head back across the Atlantic to sell their human cargo when the privateer wrecks in a storm. Antelope sails on. I'm on the Savannah River in Georgia with the U.S. Coast Guard. It was from here that the Revenue Cutter Service, as the Coast Guard was then known, first gets word that a slave ship is approaching American shores.
The Antelope is coming up through the Caribbean, trying to work its way up to where it can illegally sell the enslaved persons on board. They really were limited to coming up to Florida, the border between Florida and Georgia, and trying to meet up with smugglers and get them in through there. Word had gotten up to Savannah and St. Mary's, there's a pirate down there. They had reports that a slave ship was there. Other mariners had seen them. It was unmistakable. If you got close enough to talk, you knew there were slaves on board. Captain Jackson asked for reinforcements because he knows that a ship like the Antelope who's engaged in nefarious purposes. Revenue Cutter pursues, gets upwind of them, which is called having the weather gauge on them, and gradually closes to within about half a pistol shot.
It turns out the new captain and most of its crew are American, but they claim they are not pirates but privateers, legally sailing for a revolutionary South American government.
But American law is clear. If you're headed to the United States with illegal slaves, it doesn't matter where the Coast Guard vessel finds you.
So this is well, we're going to seize this and arrest you, and we'll let the lawyers argue about it when we get in.
Antelope's human cargo, seized from American, Portuguese, and Spanish ships, creates a legal tangle that will keep their fate undecided for more than 5 years.
Now, once they get to Savannah, they're turned over to the custody of the U.S. Marshal. And it's an important distinction there. They want to keep them under federal custody. If they go into state custody, there's a tendency for them to disappear. There would be a bond put on them, and they would never be returned. The bond would be forfeit, but it was cheaper than buying additional people.
The Africans had been brought to a country which forbade the slave trade, but where half the states practiced slavery. What would become of them? Ultimately, the courts would decide. I've come to the Owens Thomas Mansion in Savannah, built by one of Savannah's major slave owners, to meet Jonathan Bryant, an expert on the antelope. So this looks like the kind of house that Marshall lived in, Marshall socialized in Richmond.
Yes, he would have moved in circles, similar to the builder of this house, Richard Richardson, was a very active slave trader and quite wealthy.
The antelope case, after it finally reaches the Supreme Court in 1825, raises hard questions about Marshall's motives in deciding slavery cases that come before his court. So Marshall, as a slave owner all his life, how do we think that impacts his jurisprudence?
It is a difficult question.
My guess is that Marshall would have been in the top 10%, if not higher, of all Virginia slaveholders. It makes him sympathetic to the slave owner, not the slave.
Marshall was a slave owner, and yet he was also a founding member of the American Colonization Society.
The American Colonization Society was of the view that slavery should be ended in the United States, but that African American people should be sent back to Africa. Marshall was a part of the American Colonization Society because he believed that emancipation should come, but that blacks could not stay in the United States. America was not going to be a multiracial society.
These were questions for the future. The immediate issue is what to do with all the slaves from the antelope.
Probably there were 331 captives who left Africa. When they were captured by the revenue cutter, there were either 280 or 281 still alive. Whether from yellow fever or from problems brought with them aboard the ship, the captives continued dying.
So we're going from the big house to the slave quarters.
Yes, and the U.S. Marshal was in charge of these captives, and he decided to distribute them to wealthy families here in town. Enslavers in an urban situation. These are the actual slave quarters. There were probably between 7 and 9 enslaved servants who lived here.
Many of the antelope Africans were sent to urban houses because of their youth, right?
That's correct. The antelope captives were quite young, on average under 14. And so large numbers of them were placed with families here in Savannah. Very often you would, as a child, work in a household in the city, and then as you became older and stronger, you would be moved to a plantation to do farm labor.
It will take years for the case to work its way up through the lower courts as multiple claimants assert ownership, including Spain, Portugal, and the antelope's captain.
Whose slaves were these? Whose ship was this? If this was an American ship, really, if these slaves belonged to an American owner, then they would be released and returned to Africa. If, however, these slaves belonged to Portugal or Spain, Portugal and Spain were legally engaged in the slave trade, and they would presumptively be entitled to the return of these slaves to their owners or to their government if the owners couldn't be identified.
40 slaves would make you a millionaire many times over in those days. It's an enormous amount of wealth.
By the time they're making this decision in February of 1821, there are only 212 of the captives left alive. While they're deciding this, Richard W. Habersham, the United States Attorney here in Savannah, suddenly entered the case and, to everyone's surprise, announced that no, these people are free and they should be returned to Africa. And this was startling in Savannah. Savannahans assumed that everyone would get to divvy up these captives as slaves and make a little money out of this.
The federal district judge dismisses the claim of Antelope's captain, but accepts those of Spain and Portugal.
Habersham says, I'm appealing this to the Federal Circuit Court.
Marshall's Supreme Court colleague William Johnson is the circuit judge. While upholding the lower court's decision, Johnson rules that Africans aboard Antelope previously captured from an American vessel were enslaved illegally and must be freed.
And he also rules that who goes to the United States for freedom, who goes to the Portuguese, and who goes to the Spanish will all be decided by a lottery.
How do you know which of the 200 or 300 slaves are free? Put your slave. I mean, stop and figure. I mean, human beings, fate, freedom descended by, who draws a piece of paper out of the hat?
Habersham literally leaps up and he is outraged, and he announces that he's going to appeal this to the United States Supreme Court.
The Antelope case brought Marshall in the court head-to-head with the legality of the international slave trade.
Slavery was a dominant feature not just in America, but in the world, and international law protected the slave trade, and Marshall pays attention to international law.
Marshall has been buying and selling human beings his whole life. He is still doing it from his position in the center chair of the Supreme Court.
So of the 6 justices who will hear the Antelope case, we have 4 slave owners, right?
That is correct. The case finally comes before the court in the winter of 1825. A great deal of entertainment during the winter times in Washington was to go hear cases at the Supreme Court. The room was full of people. I'm convinced that Francis Scott Key, who was one of the leading appellate attorneys in Washington, D.C. at that time, and a member of the American Colonization Society, prevented this case from being buried in the Supreme Court's docket and never being heard.
He says the law is very clear. Hovering off the coast of the United States in a slave ship is a violation of federal law, and therefore, we confiscate the slaves.
John Berrien, recently elected to the U.S. Senate from Georgia, argues for the interests of Spain and Portugal.
Berrien says if you condemn the slave trade, then you're condemning slave owning itself.
And then it was in Marshall's hands.
In this case, Marshall explicitly recognized that there was a conflict between the, quote, sacred rights of liberty and property.
You can argue all day about whether the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, but there's no question it's a pro-property document.
And once Marshall recognized enslaved persons as property for purposes of constitutional law and international law, the die was cast.
Just 6 justices will hear the case, as Justice Todd is out sick. When Marshall gives his opinion, it's already been 5 years since the Antelope first arrived in Savannah.
Here, the sacred rights of liberty and property have come into conflict with each other. This court must not yield to feelings which would seduce it from the line of duty. That the slave trade is contrary to the law of nature will scarcely be denied. But can men enslaved contrary to the laws of nature be legally traded? Whatever the answer of a moralist to this question, the jurist must search for its legal solution.
The Antelope case remains one of Marshall's most controversial decisions.
In Antelope, you don't have to use the law of nature. You've got a whole bunch of federal statutes which say it's a felony public.
Even though the slave ship was first intercepted in international waters, federal law and other lower court decisions would have given Marshall sufficient reason to declare all of Antelope's slaves free.
Marshall is trying to look within the Constitution for a textual basis of how to deal with slavery that at the same time is not going to result in another Missouri controversy, another conflict over slavery.
He judiciously said, let's not have the Supreme Court push slavery onto the agenda, the political agenda. He showed an extraordinary sense of what is politically wise.
No nation can rightfully impose a rule on another. it follows that a foreign vessel engaged in the African slave trade and captured on the high seas by an American cruiser should be restored to its owners.
Marshall dismisses the Portuguese claim as bogus, a false front for American traffickers. But since the records show that Antelope was a Spanish ship, he allocates 39 Africans to the Spanish claimants. He declares 130 free to be sent to the Colonization Society's settlement in Liberia. But he has upheld the legality of the slave trade.
Marshall extended judicial authority in a lot of cases. I mean, he was a genius at extending judicial authority. Why not extend it in behalf of humanity? He didn't do it.
You know, it kind of showed that Marshall, for all his greatness, was a product of his time and place. I don't think it revealed any real sensitivity to the slavery problem. And I'm not sure he can rely on the justification that, well, nobody was concerned about it at the time, because people were, and he was not.